like to welcome everyone. My name is John Barker. I'm the facilitator of the webinar program at the Bonner Institute for Purposeful Leadership. With us today, we have the co-founder, or the founder and president of the Bonner Institute, James Bonner. And James has a long background as an executive, a board member, and now James coaches executives and boards, and also is pursuing interesting alliances and partnerships for our institute. I'd like to just provide an overall introduction to the theme of today's webinar. In the Bonner Institute's LinkedIn page, I posted an article about the paradox that CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, face. Some people call it the cybersecurity paradox. And that paradox is the following. Board members say, hey, you know what? Cybersecurity is a top priority for our board, and it's a top priority for our company. And the chief executive officer makes public statements. Cybersecurity is a top priority for our company. And yet, the chief information security officer is asked to do more hard work with less budget. And what is that? That is the paradox. How is it possible that the board and the chief executive officer make the statement, hey, we prioritize cybersecurity at the same time we're going to cut the budget? So in today's presentation, Scott Giordano and Gordon Rudd are addressing some of these issues. I would like to note that Scott's voice is having challenges today, and I have volunteered to present Scott's part. Scott and I have made presentations together, so I'm very familiar with the content, and I've asked Scott to just speak up to the best of his ability or use the chat feature. The chat feature is also available to make any comments. Perhaps I'm not emphasizing something enough, and I want to make sure and do that. So I'm going to share my screen shortly, just one moment, and I will get us started. I would like to call out the fact that Scott is an attorney and has several certifications, including AI Governance Professional, FIP, CISSP, CCSP. Gordon has the CISSP certification. Gordon and Scott are co-founders and partners of the Directors-CISOs Alliance. It is a training and advisory firm specializing in building strong relationships between directors, both corporate and nonprofits, and their chief information security officers. I'd like to give a little background information on Scott. He is the former Vice President, Corporate Privacy and General Counsel at Spirion. He specializes in multinational cross-border aspects of data protection. He's a former ISO 17024 Certifications Advisory Board member in the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Scott created and taught the first law school course on electronic evidence and discovery. He's a member of the bar associations in 3 states, California, District of Columbia, and the Washington State Bar Association. I would normally ask Scott to introduce himself, but we're protecting his voice. And Gordon, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. I think it helps if.
Sure. Well, I've been in the tech sector for 40 years now and started as a programmer, worked my way up, just have held practically every position in IT. I've been in cybersecurity for about 25 years now. And today I function as kind of a virtual chief technology officer, chief information officer, VCISO kind of thing, a virtual CISO for organizations. And of course, Scott and I try and work with boards as much as we can to try and educate them on not only what their responsibilities are and what their processes and procedures should be, but on how to understand their technical people. And we also work with the technical people on how to understand what the board needs. It's just one of those things that came out of a long history of working with boards where I've actually presented to boards before and had the in-house legal counsel tell me that the board had absolutely no fiduciary responsibility whatsoever. Uh,
Yes.
that was kind of a shock, kind of hard
Yes.
to work your way out of, but that was kind of the impetus for the Directors and CISOs Alliance, and that's how we got to be here today.
Yes, absolutely. And Gordon, I've had similar experiences where board members said they did not need to know about fiduciary duties. It's quite an interesting thing. So I'd like to start with why should you care? Why should you as a board member care? And why should you as a CISO care to reach out to your board? Well, first of all, over the past 5 or so years, there have been developments in litigation, specifically under the famous Caremark standard. Caremark established the duty of oversight and the duty to monitor. That's the board's duty to monitor and have a duty of oversight over legal and regulatory issues within the organization, and make sure that there's a good compliance and ethics program. And today, cybersecurity is part of that program. And there has been case law, that recent case law, and just in the past few years, three very important cases that introduced the idea of the mission critical standard, which lowered the burden of proof to prove that a board member or member of the C-suite has violated their fiduciary duties. And something important to note, cybersecurity has been interpreted by the courts to be a mission critical issue for organizations. And as this notes, the standard applies to corporate officers under a famous McDonald's case. And the other fairly recent development is the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's cybersecurity regulations and the SEC's charges against SolarWinds and its chief information security officer. And other developments include the European Union cybersecurity and artificial intelligence regulations. So if you do international business in the European Union, you're going to have fiduciary duty, oversight, and duty of monitoring in the European Union in terms of cybersecurity. So why is cybersecurity now a board level matter? And the CISO needs to understand this and find a way to train the board on it. And board members need to understand this, that the language that we use is very important. Well, first of all, it comes out of the duty of care, and there are two applications. There's a duty of care for the company to the world. And this, we could go very deep in detail about this issue, but we don't have time today. But there is a duty of care for the directors and corporate officers to the company. I would like to note there actually is debate in case law whether there's an absolute duty of care of the directors to the shareholders. You will find conflicting language, by the way. I've examined it. But both of these incorporate a certain standard of care. And what is that standard of care for cybersecurity? Directors and officers have the following standard. The applicable standard of care requires directors to provide reasonable or appropriate physical, technical, and administrative security measures to secure, and this is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of corporate data. Now, the famous Caremark case was decided in 1996. It's a very interesting case to read. You can read articles about it. And this is the direct language. A director's obligation includes a duty to attempt in good faith to assure that a corporate information and reporting system, which the board concludes is adequate, exists, and that failure to do so under some circumstances may, in theory at least, render a director liable for losses. Now, that corporate information and reporting system could reference, it's been frequently interpreted to be, a comprehensive compliance and ethics program, but it would include a cybersecurity information and reporting system. Now, Caremark claims are typically derivative claims. They're brought by shareholders on behalf of the company against the directors, alleging that they breached their duty of loyalty by failing to oversee key operations. Now, I will say that the fact that the shareholders have to bring it on behalf of the company is an argument in favor of the statement that directors do not have fiduciary duties to the shareholders. Instead, the fiduciary duties are to the company. But the directors, all case law agrees that the directors must act in the best interest of the shareholders. This gets very, very complicated, but I did want to note that you will see some cases make a statement that they have fiduciary duties to shareholders, and you will see contrary language. Now, the liability extended in the famous McDonald's case in 2023 to corporate officers. There was an allegation that a senior executive at McDonald's engaged in sexual harassment. This led to an SEC enforcement action, and this expanded liability to corporate officers. And that, by the way, could include the chief information security officer if the CISO is a duly appointed corporate officer. So now stockholders may hold non-director corporate officers liable for failures in oversight. Now, the shareholders actually lost this case, and it was more of a procedural issue, but it still established the standard. It's a very interesting case to read. Yahoo securities litigation involved multiple breaches in 2013, 2014, and 2016. And this is very, very important. This is something to understand. If your board knows about the data breaches before they were disclosed to the public and took actions to cover up those data breaches, well, that is going to cause some regulatory action to occur, and that makes it possible for the shareholders to sue the company. In this case, it was alleged that several of the directors sold their Yahoo stock before becoming aware of the data breaches and before the breaches were made public. This resulted in a settlement for $29 million in January 2019. Now, one thing I would like to note, if you're a CISO or a CEO and you want to get your board engaged in cybersecurity, it's very, very helpful to mention those verdicts, those settlements. This settlement represents the first time that shareholders were awarded monetary damages in a derivative data breach suit. Then there was the Facebook litigation in 2023. This was a shareholder derivative lawsuit against Zuckerberg and former board members. So board members should remember that even if they're no longer on the board, their past conduct that occurred while they were board members can still lead to liability. The lawsuit alleged that board members and Zuckerberg as a corporate officer violated a U.S. Federal Trade Commission consent order concerning the company's privacy matters. This was the famous Cambridge Analytica case. The judge allowed the derivative lawsuit to go forward, and that allowing it to go forward is an example of the mission critical standard. From 2019 to 2021, there were a series of cases. Martian v. Barnhill is the one I remember the most, which lowered the burden of proof, lowered the Caremark bar if the oversight in question was mission critical. And there have been cases that have truly simply stated that cybersecurity is a mission critical issue. In fact, courts have said specifically, if your company collects personally identifiable information, PII, about customers and suppliers, cybersecurity is mission critical. And corporate governance must evolve. And this means that board members and the C-suite have a heightened duty to assure that there are reasonable and appropriate oversight systems in place. This is a very famous case, Fireman's Retirement System versus Sorensen. So now, this is very interesting to note. There are multiple interpretations of what has happened. Some individuals say that that 1996 Caremark doctrine has never changed. It has just been newly reinvigorated and interpreted in the context of new technologies, and that will likely happen in AI. And future Caremark liability will be centered on failure to provide board level oversight of mission critical risks. So, you, as a chief information security officer, need to be very vigorous in engaging the board. Never give up on engaging the board. And remember, you might face liability for not trying to engage the board because you also have a role in that corporate oversight system. So cybersecurity is mission critical effectively to all companies today. Proactively addressing cybersecurity mitigates this risk of caremark liability. Now, artificial intelligence is a force multiplier in this context. And it's important to engage the board. There's a very famous experiment. It was an AI experiment that generated 40,000 hypothetical bioweapons in just 6 hours. Um, so, this AI system, Megasin, was designed to detect toxicity in molecules in order to avoid them, but the experiment involved instructing it to do the opposite. The instructions said, Megacin, find molecules that are similar to drugs and similar to the potent nerve agent VX. And a lot of the generated compounds were even more toxic than VX. This is a very interesting experiment that you can use to help engage the board. And there's the issue of large language model compromise and data exfiltration. Okay, so this was where the study's authors put in a prompt, poem, 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 and ChatGPT responded by not only repeating the word point, but revealing a person's email signature, which included their personal contact information. There actually have been many other examples of leaks of trade secrets and leaks of healthcare information. So, this is a real risk, and you can always just go to your public search engine and try to find examples that you can cite to your board. In very short summary, we now have through AI a semantic attack surface. Now, an attack surface represents the many vectors that bad actors employ to attack or infiltrate an IT system or device. And, we already know that databases are subject to SQL injection. A lot of times, an LLM, where you enter your prompt, you don't have the protections and limitations on what you can input into the prompt. So the LLM prompt must be exposed in order for you as a customer to employ the technology. And it is a natural language prompt, which is subject to meaning. And there's a semantic aspect to this. Now, legal systems are proactively addressing cybersecurity. Now, I would like to note that President Trump has already signed an executive order rescinding President Biden's executive order 14110, but you should not let up. There's still a lot of action at the state level, federal level, European Union, and other countries. So remember, there are many laws and regulations today that don't necessarily mention artificial intelligence, but they still are relevant to artificial intelligence. And they're absolutely focused on cybersecurity. So HIPAA, GLBA, FERPA, COPPA, California, of course. And there are issues of regulations at the criticality level, public utilities, chemical producers, digital infrastructure. We have regulation of the at the event level, so there are state breach notification laws. By the way, there are city breach notification laws. The Federal Trade Commission addresses unfair or deceptive acts. The lack of disclosure of a data breach is an unfair or a deceptive act. There certainly are still executive orders that are on the books that have not been rescinded, and we don't know what is in the future. Also, if you're a federal contractor, a defense contractor, there could be contractual obligations. And remember, individual customers and suppliers can sue in tort or contract private rights of action. At the state level, you have many state laws. First of all, you have unfair or deceptive trade practices acts at the state level, regardless of what happens at the federal level. The California Confidentiality of Medical Information Act and the New York Department of Financial Services Part 500. So you can think of it as a state counterpart of HIPAA. And sometimes the state HIPAA is more stringent than federal HIPAA. You can have executive orders by governors at the state level. There are still contractual obligations and private rights of action at the state level. And I will say at the municipal level, because in the case of Uber, the city of Chicago started an investigation. The European Union has very comprehensive laws that cover government, businesses, and nonprofit. The main one is the Global Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. It has risk management and cybersecurity requirements. There's NIST 2 for an infrastructure, the Cybersecurity Act, Cybersecurity Resilience Act, DORA, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and then, of course, the Artificial EU AI Act, which has risk management and cybersecurity requirements. So it's very important to make sure your board is aware of these legal and regulatory obligations and reach out to your general counsel or chief legal officer, your chief compliance officer. Make alliances with them. Also, we can look, and these are good statistics that you can use. The following statistics show how many fines and the sum of fines that have been posed per type of global data protection regulation violations to date. And note that insufficient board oversight, insufficient technical and organizational measures to ensure information security, there have been 405 fines, and you see that the liability is huge. Here are several other obligations. Cyber incident reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. I won't read all of these, but it's just to note that you have more obligations than you realize, and you must become aware of them. Work with your legal counsel. So, what do boards need to know, need to do now? And I'm going to make Gordon our presenter. And so, Gordon, I'm going to end my screen
Okay.
sharing and let me make you the presenter.
This is something that I always like to do and try and make sure that we level set and say a couple of things. One, every person comes to the party with their own set of lenses through their history, through their education, through their experience that they view things through. If you're a technical person on the technical side, a CISO, a CIO, member of the C-suite, you're going to have a different lens than the board. The board's going to have a different lens than you do. And I think one of the failings that we have today is we don't recognize that. We don't just say, well, the board's got a different perspective than we do. But you have to think about it simply because of the reporting structure. If you look at the organization structure in any organization, you've got a senior executive or senior management team that's reporting to the board. The board can fire every single one of them or
Mhm,
hire every single one of them. If they don't
mhm,
think the senior management team's doing a good job, they are going to make additions and subtractions. Just just exactly like a general manager for a sports team. They're looking for the best return on investment for their shareholders. Now they being the board in this instance, they also have additional requirements that relate directly to cybersecurity and how they perform. Yet I don't see a lot of direct interaction between boards and their cybersecurity team. I just don't see that yet. We've still got that filter of the senior management team in the middle. John, can you give me an advance? There we go. If you're looking at the problem from the technical side up, if you're looking at it from the CISO, trying to work with the senior management team and report to the board, you have to look at your reporting relationship first, because that's going to define what you can and can't say to the board and how you give the board bad news, if you're allowed to at all. You've got to look at your industry, because every industry has different rules. Oil and gas has got FERC. The finance industry's got the FFIEC, and so on and so forth. Then you've got to look at the company and say, okay, within our company, how are we going to handle bad news? How are we going to handle a cybersecurity incident?
Mhm.
And that's something that you just rarely hear people talk about. Just like, okay, we've got a business continuity plan. Well, if it's like most of them, I've had friends call after a disaster and say, what do we do now? And when I asked them, well, what happened to your business continuity plan? They'd say, well, it's in a 3-inch, 3-ring binder, and it's really quite comprehensive, but we haven't looked at it in 7 years. So, it's kind of out of date. So what do we do first? That kind of thing. It's not just having the plan, it's making sure that all the technical staff, all the senior management team, and the board can interact effectively when a cyber incident happens. And that's going to really, really be determined. How effective that's going to be is really going to be determined by the corporate culture. The board needs to understand the technology people who run the technology for them. And we don't see a lot of that. We see the tech people trying to explain things to boards,
Mhm.
but we don't see the board trying to go to the technical people and say, these are the 3 things that are really most important to us. How does what you do relate to that? We just don't see that yet. And that's one of the things that we hope that we can, by doing seminars like this, webinars like this, that we can advance that thought process just a little bit. John, could I have the next slide, please?
Mhm. Mhm.
One of the first things that I try and get everybody to do is look at a CMMI index, or a capability maturity model index. And as you can see by looking at the focus, if you're a small company, you're going to be a stage 1 or a level 1. You're going to be your focus. You're going to have competent people running around just with their hair on fire, trying to keep the wheels on. When you go up a notch to the second level, you get that basic project management and differentiating tactics. But to be really effective for most organizations that are going to fall under all these new federal guidelines, you're going to want to be a 3. You're going to want to at least have process standardization so that you can, if you have a cyber incident, know exactly what to do and how to handle it. One of the worst things you can do is not practice your incidents, not do a tabletop exercise, and then when something happens, you wing it. Because invariably, a member of the senior management team or a member of the board is going to say something to the press that the press is going to spin in a negative direction and run with it. And then you've got a problem. And it's not just with trying to control the narrative. All of a sudden, you may have been publicly accused by the press of some type of mismanagement, something that you should have been taking care of, just like John has explained to you. So that level of maturity is something that the board has to recognize, as well as the senior management team, and of course, the technology staff. So can I get the next slide, please?
Mhm.
How are you going to communicate with these technical people? Well, they're a little different. I've been one, so I guess I can talk about them. We are usually highly intelligent. We all share same base trait set. We're all highly intelligent. We don't really like to communicate with people. We don't really like to be in front of people and in front of crowds. You can see a problem with trying to communicate with a board right there. Okay. That's just kind of the thing. And we really get, usually when we're challenged, we want to tell you how the watch is made instead of just saying, well, this is what time it is. And that's just the way we operate. So understanding that, why don't you as a director start asking the senior management team, well, what do our technical people need to know from us? What do they need to understand so that they can follow our mission and vision. And I can't tell you how many times I've done a strategic planning process with a corporation, large corporations, and had half the board think that they were going in one direction and the other half think they were going in a different direction. And then once they decided on a common direction, they started issuing edicts to the senior management team that didn't necessarily meet that vision. So there's kind of that same thing. The board's got to look down and say, okay, if this is our vision, is the senior management team interpreting it correctly at the next level down? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the more layers you've got in a corporation, the less likely the message from the top is to get to the bottom. It just isn't going to be there. So communication between technical personnel and senior management needs to be fluid and effective. And by fluid, I mean, you've got to be able to tell the senior management team good news and bad news. You've got to be able to define the risks in terms the senior management team and eventually the board can understand. John, can I get a new slide, please? So how are you going to communicate with these people, these technical people? Well, one of the first rules is to make sure that your receiver understands the correct message. And as we've just covered, a lot of times the board's message is not the senior management team's message when the senior management team is communicating one level down. That disconnect happens more often than you'd like to think. But you've got to communicate in terms the receiver of the communication understands. It's communication one-on-one kind of thing. That's why you see a lot of news today and news articles and that sort of thing that are perhaps not communicated in an effective way, in a factual way. They're communicated in an emotional way, because people that live online understand that emotion creates a memory. And if you can create that emotion, you can create a memory. Well, what emotion is the board of the senior management team most likely to communicate down? Fear. If you don't do it this way, or if you screw up, you're going to lose your job. So that's a problem. To get over that, find a way to communicate in a fluid manner and find a common taxonomy. Now, taxonomy to the data scientist is simply giving a dictionary of what all these things that we're doing mean. It's a dictionary of where the files are located, who has access to them. That taxonomy between the board, the senior management team, and your technology team, your technology staff, is mission critical. John, can you bump me one? Thank you. Communicating with technical people is still tricky, okay? What should be happening is the board should be learning from the techies and the techies should be learning from the board. And both parties have a duty, I'll go that far, instead of just saying a job, they have a duty to educate the other. If I don't want to be held responsible for something some technical person did, or I want to make sure that I can be notified as a board member at the time of a breach, when we know we've had a breach, then I've got to allow those technical people to be able to communicate with me in a way that won't jeopardize their job, in a way that won't make them look bad or feel stupid. Trust me, they're going to feel bad anyway if they get a breach. It's going to be bad. And I want you to remember that this isn't a one-time shot. You can't just call everybody together, have an all-hands meeting, have the chairman of the board stand up and say, these are the things we need to do. Well, great. Okay. That one time won't cut it. Nobody's going to remember it, because learning is repetition, repetition, repetition. If you remember, for those of you that have had children, when your child wanted you to read the same bedtime story 400 times, and if you skipped a word, the child would say, you missed a word, Dad, you missed a word, Mom, that kind of thing. That's the child learning. That's learning. When you see your teenagers playing video games, they're playing the same game over and over and over and over. They're actually learning by doing that. They're increasing their intellectual capacity. That type of interaction with a board is almost impossible to duplicate just because of the sheer constraints of time. So, John, can I get another slide? But when you're communicating with the board, or when you're communicating with your technology team, you've got to understand that the board, as well as the technical people, are going to stay in their comfort zone. They don't want to get out of that, okay? But to be safe and to meet all the new federal requirements, you've got to go through the fear zone and get into the learning zone. And the only way you can do that is with interaction. The only way you can do that is start to have meetings with these people and have them explain things and try to understand what's going on. Now, unfortunately, for most organizations, the technical people are going to filter up a message. The senior management team are going to correct that filter, and it's going to go up in a different style to the board. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. I've worked with very large Fortune 50 companies and had a project report that's due every month. And the company that at the time was using a traffic light system, red, yellow, green. So I'd give my boss a list of my 25 projects that we had going. And if we weren't started or something, it'd be a red project to me because we weren't doing anything, that there was no evidence that we had even begun. Well, when my boss got through with it and sent it to his boss, I didn't have any red ones. And when his boss sent it to the board, we didn't have any yellow ones. So that type of filter can only be overcome if you have that fluid communication system. John, can we get a new slide? Now, one of the things that we have to do is train our technical people to communicate with us in terms that we can understand. They've got to be able to do something like this because this is what the board wants to see. XYZ's organization expected loss from a cyber event is greater than the industry average. We're setting at $220 million for a loss, let's say to ransomware, just as an example. Great, that's $220 million. The industry average is 100 to 145 million for that same loss. So the technical deficit that we have is at least 220 minus 45. That's our technical deficit. You know, worst case scenario, we've got $120 million technical deficit. That's a lot. That's not where you really want to be. So you've got to understand that the board wants to see these things. They want to understand where they're performing against their near peers. Near peers are one of those bugaboos that, for whatever reason, boards like to say, what are the people that are closest to us doing? You know, if you're in the finance industry, you're looking at a bank of a certain size. So if you're a $100 million or $100 billion bank, what are the $100 billion banks doing? How do they do it? And everybody looks at that near peer to see what they're doing. This is just diving into that and saying, yeah, okay, this is what your near peers are doing. They've got theirs down, their expected loss down to maybe $100 million. Is that good? Yeah, we can't get there from here unless we put some more money on the table. Now, obviously, you're never going to spend $10 to save $10. So the board's communication down has to be to the technical team. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we got a $100 million gap here. How much do we have to spend to cover that gap reasonably? And there's got to be some kind of a process in there that allows that to happen. John, can I get the next slide, please? Does the board have regular risk reporting? That would be one of the questions I would ask very quickly. Does the board have regular risk reporting? And go ahead and flip it, John. And by regular reporting, I mean, is somebody doing something like this that takes and this is just a vendor management. Everybody's got vendors, so this is universally applicable, in my humble opinion. Everybody's got a vendor. So if you've got a vendor and they're providing a service, what's the risk of harm or loss? What's the probability of the occurrence? What's your score? And then that gives you your initial risk calculation. The risk on the other side is the mitigating actions. So you've got your initial risk rating, your raw risk rating, and then your mitigated risk score. What's your bottom line? You've got all these tools in place. So if you just look at the top line, we can take AT&T's inherent risk score of 90 and move it down to 40. But you don't want to show the board this much detail. You want to be doing this as a cybersecurity person and roll that up to something that's meaningful to the board. And it's just really that simple. But to know what the board wants to see, to know what the board's thinking, if you go back to your $220 million versus $100 to $140 million slide, if you look at that, how does that relate to our spend? And that's got to come back from the board. One of the things, John, can you flip a slide for us? One of the things that I always encourage everybody to do from a bottom up perspective with your cybersecurity team or with your technology team is to do a skills assessment. What's your skill set? What skills do you have? What skills do you need? And come up with a training plan for your people. The board needs to do the same thing. They need to create a training plan. What skill set do they have? Do they have anybody that knows cybersecurity? And I'm working with a couple of boards now that have a cybersecurity person that has trouble turning on a computer, doesn't understand cyber, has no knowledge of it, never worked in it. In fact, they never worked in the industry they're sitting on the board of, but they're in charge of cyber. They're the cyber person and they have a committee. Okay, great. What's your current cybersecurity plan? What's your organizational risk level? What are your major threats that need to be addressed? These are things that your technical team should be telling you. So if you don't know what to tell them, you need to know, tell them these things. These 8 things would be magic for the board to just ask, do you have any staffing concerns? And that's a fairly common question that board members will ask. Any technology that should be installed, like, oh, AI, do we have AI? Is our cybersecurity tool set inclusive of AI? Are we using it? Are we somehow or other preventing bad actors that might be using AI from attacking certain attack surfaces that are sensitive to AI, like the one John mentioned earlier? And you got to look at your regulatory issues for your industry and your company. If you're in the finance industry or healthcare, you've got a ton of regulations that you want to meet. If you look at the Department of Homeland Security's 16 protected industry verticals, the thing that everybody sees nationally is FFIEC guidelines from the finance industry have morphed into healthcare as just standard business practices through high trust. Now they're morphing into other industries. You see them in oil and gas, you see them in technology, you see them not just in healthcare per se, but in the emergency services group. All those industry regulatory requirements are coming down at the same time the federal government's saying to the board, if you don't pay attention to cybersecurity, we're going to have a problem. Or more specifically, you're going to have a problem if you're not paying attention. Next slide, please. Some critical questions for the board. And I think this is kind of a combination of Scott and myself, but one of it that ties into what I just said directly is, does the board truly understand the scope of the threats and the potential impact? Now, notice we started off saying that your communication to the board should include, excuse me, some kind of an impact statement. And you might say, well, let's look at that. If we've got a $100 million loss, is that material? Well, my first question to a board is always, when we start talking about risk and risk assessments and that sort of thing, is what is your risk appetite statement? What does it look like? Do you have an official board approved risk appetite statement? Most of the time, the answer is, what's that? What is a risk appetite statement? Well, it's how much money, just to be base about it, how much money the corporation can stand to lose before they want to do something about it. Now, every organization that I've ever talked to has a risk appetite statement, even if they don't have a formal board-approved risk appetite statement. And people will say, well, how do you come up with that? I said, just ask the chief financial officer what a material loss is. They'll tell you. Every CFO that I've ever talked to has a number in his or her head. If you say, what's a material loss, they're going to say, well, it's less than 300,000. We're not going to really worry about it. It's just not, that's a rounding error. Okay, then 300,000 is the most that your technical people should be willing to lose. They should build to not lose more than 300,000 on an event. It's that simple. And when it comes to the company's technical posture, you want to make sure that policy is keeping up with practice. For those of you that are in the auditing, you know, or in something that's being audited, like technology, we're audited every year or so in the tech sector. If you're a technical person or if you're an accountant and you're getting audited for your annual audit, the worst thing you can hear from an examiner is policy doesn't meet practice, which basically says somebody in the organization's lost sight of what's actually happening and what has been approved to happen, which goes back to the board's responsibility. If the board's got a board approved policy and nobody's following it, it's not a real policy. You know, and I'm sure Scott and John can tell you all about the legal ramifications of that far better than me. But let's just say it doesn't work out well for the company. So, what is the total cost of a breach for your company is where you need to settle in. And are you doing tabletop business resiliency exercises just to make sure that all three levels, the board level, your senior management team, and your technical team, are on the same page? They understand their role in an incident. If you don't know what your role is, you know, I'm just a director occupying a chair. I might as well be a Labrador retriever. You've got to know what your role is in an incident. You've got to know where the players are going to go and what's going to happen. And you have to do it in a way that makes common sense so that you can defend it, if that makes sense. So that's basically, John, you want to flip another one? This is a task list for boards. John, I think this is probably going to be something that would best be described by legal counsel.
So, well, this is indeed, but I will say it's just as much a business and technology issue as it is a legal and regulatory issue. But this is, and it should be a joint effort to establish a cybersecurity or data protection committee and to form a joint or subcommittee to address cybersecurity and AI. And AI, just remember, it presents all these new cybersecurity risks as well as cybersecurity defense. And there should be, and this is, I think, one of the most important issues. It goes back to the taxonomy, the enterprise-wide understandings of definitions of key issues, including when do I know I have a cyber security or information security event or incident or breach? What does it mean in my company, in my line of business? And then there needs to be consensus about materiality for the Securities and Exchange Commission. There should definitely be an AI governance committee. A lot of times, by the way, cyber and AI is being put in an audit committee, but the audit committee might not have sufficient breadth to address it. So this AI focused committee would address all aspects of AI use and by business partners. Remember, there is now an obligation to do that vendor risk assessment. And you need to make sure that all the stakeholders that you're dependent on understand the list of prohibited uses. And it's just as important to have AI expertise as cybersecurity expertise. You want to work with the executive leadership team. Now, I will say this many times, and I've observed this, the CISO is blocked from board access. So it's really very important that the CISO try to understand who has access to the board. Often the general counsel will have access, so the CISO should establish that relationship. And it's very important that the CISO the general counsel work together to create necessary policies and training about those policies, by the way. And the board should receive quarterly briefings and engage in periodic live training exercises to simulate AI-related failures and pressure test the company incident response plans. And remember, you need those incident response plans need to comply with whatever laws and regulations there are. There are data breach notification laws. There could be that might be at the federal level for your specific industry and at the state level for your specific industry. Different states have different standards. Gordon, anything else that I miss?
No, I think one of the things that I would do to kind of go back to a question that Charles was asking earlier,
Mm-hmm.
if you can do a skills assessment of your board in relation to technology, cybersecurity, let's say cybersecurity specifically, you should already have some kind of an idea of the skill set and some kind of a training plan for every technical person that's in your company. If
Yes.
you can do the same thing for the board, and then you can come up with a training
Mm-hmm.
program
Mm-hmm.
that will allow the board to go to certain industry incidents that are geared more to directors and that sort of thing. And, uh, you know, you can please feel free to contact John. I am absolutely certain he knows a dozen different places you can go get board level technical advice. So,
Yes.
it's not that hard to get. You just got to ask for it. But the board
Mm-hmm.
has to do that and create their training plans so that they're coming up to speed to where they need to be. And they're also understanding that fluid communication that they need to have with the technical people. Uh, if you ever want to just synthesize it down to a bottom line thing, one of the things that technical people, and again, being one, I guess I can talk about us, technical people have said over and over for 20 years is if we turn HR off for a week, will anybody notice? But let IT go down for an hour and let's see how many people get fired.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Corporations run on technology.
Mm-hmm.
Board not understanding how that technology fits into all the things that go into oil and gas, healthcare, finance, and that sort of thing, today is becoming inexcusable. It's
Mm-hmm.
becoming a liability that could actually cost the company tens of millions of dollars, as John already showed you in the early part of this presentation. John, I'll kick it back to you.
All right. So, summary and conclusions. Board oversight burdens have increased in recent years, particularly due to the idea of mission critical. I would like to note mission critical has been defined in state case law. So, you might think the new presidential administration will change that. That is not necessarily the case. So, pay attention to Delaware law. And officers, including the CISO, are now being held to the same standard. And a proactive, sustained effort that advances cybersecurity in light of AI is needed. And there needs to be a much closer relationship between the board and the CISO. And that is the end, and we can all unmute and have a discussion if we like. Scott, I hope I adequately covered your portion. And Gordon, excellent presentation. And I think we sent out a link to Gordon's original presentation, and I recommend taking a look at that. Does anyone have a question or comment? We do have many comments in the chat feature. Charles or David, any questions or comments from Dennis? Dennis, I'm sorry.
Hey, all. Thank you very much for the information and your time. This has been really good, and Scott's been answering some of the questions
Yes.
that have been in the chat. Thank you, Scott.
Well, John, James, thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Uh, If I can speak in my name, I'd just like to tell you how much I appreciated the webinar. I found it to be extremely informative, useful, and most of all for non-experts such as myself, I found it understandable. So I'm very grateful for all of that. And I want to thank you for your time and the efforts that you put into this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank
And
you very much.
if John can ever talk you into coming back, you'd be more than welcome.
Anytime. Always happy to help a friend.
I do want to note, Charles just asked a question. What do we think about CISOs getting coverage under directors and officers liability policies? Is the request reason to get board attention? Charles, this is definitely a topic dear to our hearts.
Mhm.
We absolutely believe that CISOs should get D&O insurance. Traditionally, CISOs have not been duly appointed corporate officers, and D&O insurance has been reserved for duly appointed corporate officers. So if you are a CISO negotiating an employment contract, you would want to bring that up in the employment negotiations. If you are an existing CISO, you should inquire into that. Some D&O insurers you can ask for an extension if you are not presently covered. And if you are a virtual CISO, you'll want to make sure that your contract as a supplier with that company addresses potential liability issues. Insurance is an area where we could go very, very deep into contractual, legal, and regulatory issues. So,
You do definitely need to make sure that you're covered. That's a
yes,
question you have to ask because all D&O policies are not created the same.
exactly. That's right.
And I've read policies that say basically if you're not a director of the organization, you're not covered under D&O.
That's right.
Then
I
I've
think
read
that-
others that say the directors and the senior management team are. Well, if you're a CISO and you're not part of the senior management team, are you covered? You know, and
That's right.
one of-
That's right. So
one of
it's
those questions you just absolutely have to make sure that you understand. And if today, in my humble opinion, if I'm working as a CISO for a Fortune 500 company, I want to make sure that I'm first covered under somebody's insurance. And second, that I've got some legal counsel's phone number in my hip pocket that I can call. Because my second call after calling the CEO and saying we've had an incident or a breach better be to my legal counsel to say, what am I getting into here? Just because the federal government can act in any way they see fit right now, and they've got the tools to do just exactly what they've done, bring the CISO in front of a judge and say, this is probably your fault.
Yes.
And I know none of us have ever seen anybody be scapegoated in a corporate environment like that. Nobody's ever seen that, right?
Right. Exactly. Thank you, everyone. I wish everyone a fantastic rest of the day. And hopefully you're in a warm or relatively warm climate. I'm not at the moment, nor is James, but we'll get some warm weather soon. Have a great day, everyone.